Grade crossing. Train rolls past, steady, unremarkable, almost boring. Cut to 1957. Casey Hill, 18 years old, first day on the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. An engineer who has run this route since the Truman administration is standing next to him. He does not hand Hill a manual, he tells him to listen. That's where this story starts. What those men carried, what lived in their hands, ears, and years, was never written down. Nobody thought it needed to be. Then came the decision that it also did not need to exist. You just learned what was lost. This is the story of what it actually was. Brett Wadke's family has been running trains longer than some towns have had electricity. 6 generations, each one stepping up into the cab, each one learning the same lesson. You do not just drive a locomotive, you inherit it. Brett's grandfather could name every milepost between Omaha and Cheyenne blindfolded, not because it was written down, but because he felt the sway of every curve and listened for the change in the rails when the grade shifted. You learned by watching, by listening, by screwing up and being corrected, sometimes sharply, by men who had survived things you had not even imagined yet. Casey Hill started in the roundhouse at 18, sweeping floors, then working up the ladder from brakeman to trainman to conductor to engineer. No one handed him a manual thick with rules. Instead, they handed him a lantern and told him, "Stay close, listen." The apprenticeship ladder was as fixed as the rails themselves. Brakemen learned the weight of a train by the feel of the couplers. Trainmen memorized which bridges iced over first. Conductors carried the unwritten book, the magazine of practical knowledge that Angus Sinclair described in 1885, inside their heads, adding to it every run. Sinclair wrote, "The knowledge that keeps a train safe is not in the rule book, but in the notebook a man writes for himself, in the dark, by lantern light." That magazine passed from hand to hand, always growing, never finished. The first route certification manuals did not show up until the 1970s, and even then, they were just a skeleton. The living flesh was still passed down in the cab, in the yard, in the stories told over burnt coffee at dawn. Robert Burkhart, a Pennsylvania engineer, could tell you which axle was running hot by the pitch of the whine at 80 miles an hour. His father taught him that every engine had its own voice, a kind of mechanical dialect you learned by ear, not by reading. You had to listen, Burkhart said. Every engine had its own voice. This world ran on ritual and repetition. Apprentices rode shotgun for years, learning the territory by heart, not just for efficiency, but because the price of forgetting was measured in wrecks and funerals. What lived in those hands and ears was never just a matter of pride, it was survival, and it was never written down. The numbers did not care about the stories. Between 2015 and 2022, the Class 1 railroads erased 45,000 jobs from their payrolls. The spreadsheets recorded every position eliminated: engineers, conductors, machinists, signalmen, carmen, each line a subtraction, each cell a closed ledger. Yet the trains kept running. Freight volumes held steady across those years. The tonnage, the miles, the schedules all matched or exceeded the old marks. The work remained, but the hands that did it were fewer, and the days grew longer for those left behind. On paper, the system looked leaner, more efficient. But the math was not about trains or steel, it was about capital. In the same stretch, the 6 major railroads returned nearly $200 billion to shareholders through buybacks and dividends, outpacing what they spent on their own tracks, bridges, and yards. Infrastructure investment trailed behind, a distant second to quarterly returns. The numbers were clear: fewer workers, same freight, more money sent upward. The machines did not protest. The ledgers balanced. The pivot came in 2019. That year alone, more than 20,000 railroaders were cut loose. Some were told their skills were obsolete, others were simply given a number and a date. The layoffs were not a response to shrinking business. They were a decision made in boardrooms, justified by formulas, and executed line by line in the payroll system. The loss was not just in bodies or hours. It was in the slow evaporation of experience, the thinning of the chain that once linked apprentice to veteran, yard to mainline. By September 2021, the warning came from the top of the regulatory ladder. Surface Transportation Board Chairman Martin Oberman said it plain. The railroads have cut their workforce to the bone, prioritizing short-term returns over long-term safety and reliability. His words landed like a spike hammer against the numbers, but the system kept moving, lighter than ever before. The spreadsheets recorded every position eliminated. Nobody recorded what left with them. The old engineer said, "You can teach a man the rules in a week, but it takes a lifetime to hear the train." In the cab, knowledge lived in muscle and bone. The official manuals listed every grade, every signal, every curve. But the essentials, the feel of a loaded hopper as it bucked over a frost heave, the way a whistle echoed off grain elevators in winter, the thrum that meant a wheel was just starting to go flat, none of that was written down. You carried it in your body, passed along by those who had learned it the hard way. There were categories for this kind of knowing. Route memory, the ability to call out every milepost and speed restriction from memory, even in fog or blackout. Mechanical listening, the art of picking out a failing bearing or a cracked spring from a background of roaring steel and diesel. Emergency instinct, the split-second judgment that told you when to dump the air, when to ride it out, when to trust the machine, and when to override it. None of these fit inside the lines of a certification exam. Academic researchers tried to measure what lived in those cabs. In a laboratory, they played recordings of bearing and wheel fault sounds for veteran engineers and for novices. The best algorithms, using continuous wavelet transforms, reached 95% accuracy. But the old hands, men and women who had spent decades in the seat, could beat the computers, especially in the chaos of real-world noise. In 2009, an Amtrak Acela engineer picked up a sharp knocking at 150 miles per hour. The onboard sensors had not flagged anything. He stopped at the next station. The wheel flat measured 3 millimeters, enough to have caused a derailment before any detector could have caught it. It was the engineer's ear, not a line in the rulebook, that kept the train on the rails. Hugh Sawyer Jr., who ran freight out of Toledo for 40 years, put it this way: "You can't write down what a bad wheel sounds like until you have heard 1,000 good ones, and by the time you know, you are the last one who does." Certification can prove you know the rules. It cannot prove you know the railroad. The difference is not academic. It is the gap between safe arrival and disaster, between a close call and a headline. The ledger books never counted this, but the men in the cab knew. And once that knowledge walks out the door, there is no shortcut to get it back. Hunter Harrison's name traveled through the yards long before the investor calls ever reached the crew room. He started at Illinois Central not with a lantern or a wrench, but with a stopwatch and a ledger, watching for minutes lost and cars left standing. His idea was simple: do not let the railroad wait for the train, make the train wait for nothing. Precision Scheduled Railroading, they called it. PSR for short. It sounded like a technical fix, a way to run tighter, cleaner, faster. But in the cabs and the yards, it came down as a new law: move more with less, and do not look back. The numbers that mattered now were not on the milepost signs or the switch lists, they were in the operating ratio. Every 0.1% shaved off the ratio meant millions for the shareholders. Hedge funds like 3G Capital and Pershing Square crowded the boardrooms, demanding more cuts, faster returns. The old heads watched as the pressure rolled downhill. Yards that had stood for a century closed. Sidings pulled up, shops shuttered, spare crews cut loose. Trains grew longer, 2 miles of steel and freight, but the crews shrank. What used to take a team of 5 now ran with 2, sometimes with a trainee still learning which levers to trust in the dark. Randy Sabin remembers the first time he felt the change. He had spent 30 years running coal out of North Dakota. He knew every siding by heart. Suddenly, the orders came down. No more waiting for helpers, no more doubling the hill. The manifest had to roll, even if it meant stretching the brakes and risking a stall. The new schedules left no room for the old lessons. There was no margin for a greenhorn to ride along and learn by ear. The next generation, if it arrived, would have to figure it out alone at speed. Dan Sabin, Randy's son, watched the mentorship chain snap in real time. Before PSR, a new hire would shadow a veteran for months, sometimes years, picking up the route mile by mile, learning the quirks of each locomotive, the warning signs before a bearing. Let go. Under the new regime, there was barely time to hand over the keys. The pressure to move freight left no slack for teaching, no patience for questions. Mistakes that would have been caught by a second set of eyes now slipped through, hidden by the pace. The doctrine of efficiency demanded that every minute be accounted for, every dollar justified. But what got lost in the accounting was the time it takes to build a railroad man. Not the hours on a timesheet, but the years spent listening, watching, absorbing the unwritten rules that keep a train on the rails. The numbers on the quarterly report could not measure the value of a warning shouted across a yard or a hand on the brake at just the right moment. PSR promised a leaner, faster railroad. In practice, it stripped away the space where knowledge lived and where safety grew. The apprenticeships withered, the stories faded, and the chain that once bound one generation to the next dissolved in the name of efficiency. A railroad man used to know what his next day looked like. Now he learns his fate from a text message, 90 minutes notice to drop everything and run, or risk losing points in a system nobody voted for. At BNSF, it's called high vis, a points game that treats a fever, a funeral, or a child's recital as equal offenses. Step off the extra board and you're already down. Miss a call, lose points. Run out, face suspension. There is no slack, no room for a bad night or a broken car or a snowstorm that blocks your driveway. Even the old-timers can't remember it ever being this relentless. Steve Snyder, 40 years on the rails, says it flat. Never been as bad as right now, not even close. The old roundhouses, those cathedrals of steel and smoke, are shuttered, padlocked, or bulldozed. The numbers are stark. Dozens closed in the last decade, towns stripped of their last good jobs. The apprenticeships that once started in those shops are gone. There's no place to sweep floors, no one to hand you a wrench and say, watch and learn. The chain breaks in silence. Fathers who taught their sons to listen for the thrum of a bad wheel now tell them not to sign up at all. The knowledge that once passed from hand to hand is gone, with no one left to catch it. The new regime calls it flexibility. For the men and women on call, it feels like a boot on the neck. The extra board, once a stepping stone, is now a revolving door. Attrition numbers climb 10, 12, 14% a year. The pipeline is dry, the railroad runs, but the knowledge that kept it safe leaks away, drop by drop, every time a veteran walks out for good. When the chain breaks, you don't just lose a worker, you lose a century of memory and there's no way to buy it back. On the night of February 3, 2023, a Norfolk Southern freight train rolled through East Palestine, Ohio. The train was nearly 2 miles long, 151 cars, 3 locomotives, and a crew of 2. As it crossed the grade, a bearing on one of the cars began to overheat. 20 miles before the town, a trackside hotbox detector measured the temperature. It was high, but not above the company's threshold. The train kept moving. The next detector, just outside Salem, clocked the bearing at 103 degrees hotter than normal, still not enough to trigger an automatic stop. Only when the final detector, a mile from disaster, sounded the alarm did the crew begin to slow. By then, the bearing had failed completely. The car derailed, spilling chemicals and fire into the night air. Sensors worked exactly as programmed, but they did not know what an old head would have felt: a subtle shift in the drag, a new song in the rails, the warning that lives in the bones of someone who has seen a bearing go bad before. The men in the cab had minutes, not miles, to react. The rulebook was clear, the margin for error was gone. In the months that followed, the Federal Railroad Administration issued a bulletin. The language was stark. The loss of experienced railroad workers has resulted in diminished capacity to detect and respond to emergent safety risks. Automated systems are not a substitute for the practical knowledge acquired through years of service. The warning did not name East Palestine, but the message was plain. The chain had broken. The detectors could only see what they were told to look for. The men who once heard trouble coming, sometimes before the machines, were gone. The railroad has always been a system of checks and balances, steel against steel, man against machine, memory against the unknown. When the unwritten magazine of knowledge is lost, the gap is not just in the record. It is in the moment where judgment must outrun the algorithm. Once that chain is broken, it cannot be spliced back together by policy or pay raise. The math does not work. What was left in those hands is gone. Out here, the steel doesn't care about policy. It listens only to hands that know its language. Today, algorithms ride the rails, but the instincts that once caught a bad bearing by sound alone are gone. You can't spreadsheet judgment or hire back what left in someone's fingertips. The cost isn't just efficiency, it's safety paid in memory. The math never works when you try to automate trust.